Okay, hello to everyone, and welcome to another Friends of Multilateralism FMG interview series on MC12 and Beyond. As you know, Friends of Multilateralism group was established in 2016 and focusing on WTO reform and inclusive economic growth and composing independent experts like formal ambassadors or permanent representatives, and also senior officials of organizations, as well as professors and think tank people. So today we have the honor to have our FMG member and also FMG board member, Stuart Harbinson. And before he retired, he has done many things, including as a permanent representative of Hong Kong, China to the WTO. And today we are going to discuss one thing around MC12, that is the plurilateral initiatives. Of course, official name would be Joint Statement Initiatives. So with that, thanks a lot, Stuart, for being with us, and welcome to this interview.
Thanks a lot, Lou, and it's a pleasure to be with you today, and look forward to an interesting chat about joint statement initiatives.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. One thing I noticed is that, of course, we all know that the joint statement initiatives are not yet formally mandated by the WTO, and that's why also they are not officially reflected in the this MC12 outcome documents or various achievement documents. But I did notice that in the outcome document of MC12, there were two articles, so Article 13 and 14. So Article 13 mentioned women empowerment and MISMIS, so micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and acknowledging their contribution to inclusive and sustainable economic growth. And Article 14 mentioned the environmental challenges, including climate change, and note the importance of the contribution that the multilateral trading system can make. So these two paragraphs are very interesting because they talk about something very much beyond trade, and also acknowledging the role of trade that can play to help address these issues. And behind this, we all know that behind women empowerment, we have a JSI of trade and gender, and we also have an informal working group on MISMIS, and also we have quite a few initiatives on environmental challenges and the trade role. So what do you think about this, and what's your view about probably the kind of general situation of the JSIs and their status in the WTO work? Thank you, Stuart.
Thanks, Lou. Yes, and you're absolutely right, of course, that these initiatives are not formally mandated by the WTO, but interestingly, as you say, there are some references in the outcome document to some of them. What strikes me at a general level is that we now have 7 or 8 of these initiatives, depending on what you count exactly. And the participation level as open plurilaterals is quite high. I think, you know, a lot of the initiatives have attracted 70, 80, 90, 100 or 110 participants. The one that's perhaps got a lower level of interest at present is fossil fuel subsidies reform, but the others have attracted a lot of interest and a lot of participation. So that seems to me to indicate that there is an appetite amongst the membership, bearing in mind that not all 164 members are present on the ground in Geneva, that you know, that there's a lot of interest in this, and perhaps a recognition that the WTO needs somehow to address these issues in a more concrete way than it has in the past. Of course, also plurilateral discussions amongst groups of members are nothing new. This has been happening all the time from the GATT days through to the WTO. What is slightly different is that these have been kind of formalized into initiatives on the margins of the WTO, and they're feeding back into the WTO through reporting and that sort of activity, even though not all members are on board with that. But I think generally speaking, one would have to say that the way these JSIs have developed indicates that there is a pretty strong appetite for discussions of this nature.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. And that's exactly how we look at the various initiatives, their different configuration. But we will also discuss probably the participation later on. But one thing, if we look at what has happened around MC12, of course, not only MC12 June this year, but also November last year when we the original plan was to host the MC12 in December 2021. So we did see kind of various progress or actions by different initiatives. For example, the domestic regulation, service domestic regulation, has actually concluded, and now they are already being implemented. And then we also saw that the informal group on the MIS has already adopted a package of 6 recommendations, and others, I think, which like investment facilitation, said that they will conclude the negotiation by the end of this year. And e-commerce also said that they will make substantial progress in 2022. So on and so forth. So you see that some are already being done, implemented, some are to be done by the end of this year or later on. Some others are still going on, like the trade and environmental sustainability structure discussions are still going on. Informal dialogue of plastic pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade, so IDP, still going on. Fossil fuel subsidy reform still going on, so on and so forth. So how do you look at these various initiatives, their progress, some more advanced, some less? And what do you think, what needs to happen to make sure that they all move ahead steadily? Sooner or later, they will show us what they could really use trade to contribute to addressing these challenges.
Yeah, a very good question. Thanks, Lou. From my perspective, I would say one striking feature of the JSIs is that they come in a variety of configurations with differing aims and methodologies and objectives. So, as you rightly say, services domestic regulation, they've developed their reference paper, and they are in the process now of implementing that through amendment of the participants' services schedules on an MFN basis. So that is one approach. But of course, the scheduling approach doesn't fit everything. And interestingly, I think if you look at subjects like MSMEs, they've developed, as you said, a set of recommendations on policy towards MSMEs. And I thought that was a really interesting development. I mean, some people might argue that this is not really the WTO way of doing things, that it's a legal organization and that we're only interested in binding commitments. But the MSME exercise has been extremely interesting in my view, because it is more policy oriented. And many commentators over the years have pointed out that the WTO has been deficient in terms of its deliberative function and in trying to develop policies in various areas of international trade. And I thought the MSME exercise was excellent in that respect. Who knows in the fullness of time where that might go? You know, it might develop into something different. And they've made a start, which I think is really excellent. So I thought that was a very welcome development. In other areas, potentially investment facilitation for development, maybe even e-commerce. We don't know yet, it's not clear. Perhaps they're aiming at multilateral agreements of some sort at the end of the day. So it's really a very mixed picture. And then on the environmental side, as you said, we've got structured discussions and a lot of engagement on plastics, pollution trade, and also fossil fuel subsidies reform. So these are at an earlier stage, and it's not clear, how they may evolve. So that's a very striking feature, that although we kind of talk about JSIs, joint statement initiatives, as if they were kind of one set of issues, in fact, the methodologies being explored in these discussions is extremely varied.
Yeah, Stuart, that's really excellent description of the situation. I think, as we have discussed in the past, that the reason behind this is that we see more and more global challenges, be it on climate change, be it on social inclusion, and other aspects. And we all recognize, I mean, the organizations, members, and as stakeholders, all recognize that the trade can play a very important role there. So that's why we call it this kind of trade and agenda, or trade plus agenda. So trade plus agenda, gender, trade plus environment, so on and so forth, climate change. So that's something, of course, encouraging that even some members are taking action. Of course, one thing particular about this is that they are all open to other members who are not yet ready to join. So it's not inclusive, very much inclusive. The other thing which you say that make a lot of sense is that they have different focus, but also tend to have potentially different formats of achievements. Like MISMIS is more policy oriented. That's what we call soft law. But others, like e-commerce, others may become multilaterally legal abiding thing. But be it soft or be it hard law, they all have their values, and a lot of past history of the multilateral trading system tells us that a lot of things started with soft law and afterwards became hard law and part of the WTO framework. So I think that's also another point. But one thing you said in your presentation is that those are not legal mandated. So service domestic regulation, because of the peculiar nature or the structure of the service agreement, they have probably easier leg to extend themselves into the WTO, the multilateral trade legal framework, through revising these schedules. But he also said that this does not necessarily work for other joint statement initiatives. And we have discussed this in the past, and also we know that some members do have a different view, such as India and South Africa. They have tabled a proposal challenging the plurilateral initiatives and questioning whether they are part of the multilateral framework or not. And we do know that in the past, the WTO has this Annex 4 with a few plurilateral initiatives, but it's very hard to see how we could incorporate them through that leg or anything else. So there's a gap there, there's a division there. So what do you think, and that this could be discussed in the future when we are moving ahead with these joint initiatives? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lou. Yeah, this is an extremely difficult question, and actually complicated a bit in some ways, because we've been saying that these initiatives, discussions, open plurilaterals are not mandated by the WTO. But if you look at services domestic regulation, in fact, that is mandated by the WTO under Article 6.4 of the GATS. So, and in fact, negotiations have been going on for many years without result. the working party that has been looking at that. I think what's happened in services domestic regulation is that a group of members has become intensely frustrated with the lack of progress on the multilateral front. And hence, they have set off on their own to develop these disciplines and to implement them. But interestingly, this is on an MFN basis. So it's not going to be discriminatory. Whatever additional commitments that these members who are involved in services domestic regulation take in terms of binding themselves to increased disciplines, that will apply to members who are not part of the initiative as well as those who are in the initiative. So that's quite a distinct case. But you very rightly referred to the controversy about the relationship between these types of initiatives and the WTO. In services domestic regulation, they're proceeding through scheduling. There are procedures for that. There's an objection procedure, and that has to work its way through, and we'll see what will happen. But in general terms, of course, it's really difficult to attach plurilateral agreements to the WTO under Article 10(9), I think it is, of the WTO agreement. You need consensus to attach a new plurilateral agreement to the WTO agreement in Annex 4 thereof. And that's likely to be an insurmountable obstacle unless the discussions that are now going to take place on WTO reform come up with something different. But that will take a long time. One can't see that happening very, very quickly. In the meantime, however, I would just say that in recent years, the members have shown quite a significant degree of pragmatism in designing new ways forward in terms of binding agreements. For example, of course, we had the trade facilitation agreement, which you might in some respects characterize as an opt-in agreement, i.e. members just took commitments and obligations in line with their ability to do so. And then I thought was a very interesting development at MC12 was the ministerial decision on the TRIPS agreement in relation to COVID. And there you have this very interesting footnote, I think it's footnote 1, which now brings the possibility of a sort of opt-out arrangement. And that was as a result of some very pragmatic discussions, I think, between particularly the United States and China. So, I mean, I'm wondering if that is also another string to the bow. I have a feeling that the members are groping their way towards a more pragmatic method of operation in terms of incorporating new obligations and commitments into the WTO. Of course, it's early days on that, but maybe this is something that could be made use of, I don't know. Before the subject of WTO reform and the question of how to include new agreements in Annex 4 is able to make progress.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Two things. The first thing is that you are not the only one who's saying that this footnote 1 of TRIPS waiver this kind of opting out mechanism could be used actually for future initiatives by a grouping of members. The WTO-DDG Annabelle has also said this in her trade blog, and I think that's a very pertinent point. So the thing is that you need pragmatism, but also being innovative because every, as you said, that every plurilateral initiatives, JSIs, have their own focus, objective, and also their nature of issues. So we have to really adapt the mechanism towards itself so as to make sure that it could go through its own life of circle. So that's one very good point. The second one, I also agree very much that WTO has 164 members now, and at various development level, different policy priority, and also different objectives in terms of the trade participation. But there is a strong demand from at least some members to move ahead on some of those issues, like those in relation to the global challenges. And this is not only on JSIs, but also if we look at the outcome document, this paragraph, I think 3 or 4, on the WTO reform, while it says that the General Council and the subsidiary bodies should be overseeing the WTO reform process, but there's one footnote to say that groupings of members could also sit down together, discuss, and even make proposals to the General Council and the subsidiary bodies. So that's also a kind of a clear indication that some members want to move ahead. Of course, if you try to stop them, and then frustration would arise. And I did hear once, I think at an occasion, some WTO representatives just say that if we cannot do it in the WTO, we will just do it anyway, somewhere. So like on e-commerce, we already see this DEPA, so digital, I think it's called Digital Economic Partnership Agreement by New Zealand and Singapore, I think quite some time ago. And there are new countries already applied to join it, like China and others, and the UK. So I think those are the things that we need to bear in mind, that members want to move ahead, and the business associations and companies also want to move ahead. And this time around MC12 and on e-commerce, there are 105 business associations issued a joint statement asking the WTO to and the joint initiatives, statement initiatives on e-commerce to move ahead. I think that's also a strong thing there. But one thing, Stuart, I want to especially ask for your opinion is, as you say, that the configuration varies from 40 something on fossil fuel subsidy reform, and to all the way to 110 or 120 on trade and gender, on investment facilitation. But this, generally speaking, we do see that the participation of developing countries into, if not all of them, most of these initiatives are still very much limited, especially the least developed countries. Even this time, we did see that some of them are expanding, but with only a few. So service domestic regulation, they have 3 new members, I think is Georgia and Timor-Leste and the United Arab Emirates. There are a few more, Samoa joining the fossil fuel, yeah, I think those are more or less a few new members joining, but not many. We do see that developed countries are still hesitating. So what do you think that should happen that make sure that we would have the kind of mechanism to facilitate or to help those developing countries, especially LDCs, to participate in those initiatives, so as to make it more if not multilateral, but more representative in terms of the WTO membership? What do you think?
Well, I think you put your finger on a huge issue there, Lou, and very rightly so. It's an enormous challenge for many developing countries and LDCs to keep track of what's going on in the WTO. And it's fair enough to say that there's an appetite for discussing these subjects. And I think there's an appetite in a lot of developing countries and LDCs too, because they fully understand that these big global challenges, for example, in relation to the environment and climate change, require global solutions, and they desperately want to be part of that discussion, but yet they lack the resources to do so. And in some cases, if you look at e-commerce, for example, they kind of lack the domestic regulatory infrastructure to be able to do so. So this is an enormous challenge. It's good to see that in some of these initiatives, such as e-commerce, consideration is being given to this in terms of capacity building and technical assistance. But you know, these things are great, but they also can have limited impact. If all of these discussions are taking place in the WTO, and we've got all of the regular machinery to follow, and we have 7 or 8 JSIs, we've got a big discussion coming up on WTO reform. How is a delegation with 1 or 2 people in Geneva covering the UN and the WTO going to be able to follow all of this? I mean, it's not just a question of sort of willingness. It's a question of almost a boots on the ground to be able to keep track of all of this. And I think this is an enormous challenge that the coordinators of these initiatives and the main proponents are going to have to think about, because they need to bring delegations with them. And if they're really looking for global solutions to global problems, then they need to make sure that you know, the smaller developing countries and LDCs are plugged in and able to take part and express a view. So huge challenge. I mean, I don't have a one-size-fits-all approach. Obviously, technical assistance and capacity building has got to be a big part of it, but I think it goes deeper than that, and it's something that we're going to have to pay a lot more attention to in future.
Yeah, thanks. E-commerce is an excellent example to illustrate that, because we all know about this digital divide, and the developing countries lack not only infrastructure but also resources and all these things to be able to benefit from the digital new technologies and also the trade around that. And we did notice that around MC12, the coordinators of the e-commerce initiative has launched this so-called e-commerce capacity building framework. And with that, they have established a new digital advisory and trade assistance fund, as well as a digital capacity building support. So I think that's a very much a targeting instrument, really focusing on the issue we are talking here about, the lack of participation of developing countries. As you said, it's not lack of willingness, it's more lack of capacity. The thing, and also I think you're very right that there's not a one-size-fits-all kind of action for all initiatives or all different countries to help with that. But I think you said it very rightly that the coordinators and the leading participants of these initiatives, those with the capacity, be it developed or advanced developed countries, should really develop a kind of holistic approach to help those developing countries in need. If I just could quickly maybe bring something out at this stage, is that one thing I think that probably the coordinators should be more proactive in reaching out to those developed countries and the DCs who are interested but don't have the capacity, probably to keep on feeding them with the information about progress, issues, discussion, and then so as they know what is going on, so they are kept in the loop. The second thing would be that they could ask think tanks probably to do more researchers focusing on the benefits or challenges of developing countries and NDCs if they joined those initiatives and the future agreements, be it on policies or be it on rules, which would, the kind of impact or the opportunities for those countries. I think those would also help them to understand what would I get or what would I have as challenges if I join those initiatives. The other thing you said also is right, that the missions here, especially LDCs and developing countries, they have only 1 or 2 people covering WTO and the UN organizations. So the thing here is that you have to really find a way to engage probably the capital-based officials, maybe providing funding to fly them in, or doing more virtual meetings so they could connect immediately, provide them with the connection, provide them with the computer, laptops. And last thing, probably that's also we are seeing actually on quite some other issues, is that WTO cannot work on all of them on its own. WTO has established quite some fund on fisheries, on other things, and including on e-commerce. But WTO would not be able to manage all of them. So that's why we see a lot of collaboration among different organizations. So World Bank, IMF, OECD, IDC, UNCTAD. I think they should join hands together, trying to play their kind of different roles in helping developed countries. I think that probably would kind of bring a kind of their strengths together to help this. Those are just some ideas that I think, but you are right. This is one of the probably the biggest challenges for the plurilateral initiatives to be multilateral in the future, engaging more developing countries. So, Stuart, one last question. It's not a question, but after we discuss all these things, the legal challenge, the challenge of developing countries, and the progress, and also some things are moving ahead more quickly than others. But we do see that MC12 has done quite a lot on this joint statement initiatives. But a lot needs to happen in the future after MC12. So the last thing, probably, what's your message to the WTO membership, the ambassadors, the capital-based officials, and also stakeholders on how we could foresee the next step of the work on these joint statement initiatives, and so as we could see more progress on all of them. So the last message, Patrick. Yeah.
Yeah, well, difficult to boil it down to one message, I guess, given that these various initiatives, as I've said, are have a rather different natures. But I suppose at the heart of a lot of this is the question of what sort of a WTO we want in future. Is it one, as some members appear to think, where we have a lot more variable geometry and more scope for plurilateral type agreements, perhaps not MFN based in some cases? Or are we going to try to move together as we have in the past on a multilateral basis, but be a bit more pragmatic and flexible about how we go about that? I was struck just reading an article in the Financial Times a couple of days ago. Martin Wolf, who was kind of the doyen of multilateral trade commentators, saying that, well, he described MC12 as a limited success, but he said that it has at least kept the machine working. And I think that's right. And I personally, I would like us to see everyone working on keeping the machine working in a slightly better way. So more flexibility, more pragmatism, I think, is what we need. I think everybody understands that we need to address a lot of these issues. They're to do with the rules of the system rather than anything to do with market access. If you look at environment, services, MSMEs, e-commerce, it's all about rules mostly, hardly anything on market access. And we have a common interest, and I think the members have a common interest in continuing to make progress. It'll be difficult, no doubt, but it's well worth the effort.
Thank you, Stuart. That's an excellent message to be passed about this broader and probably even we could call it a strategic question about what do we want WTO in the future. Of course, on this, we do see that MC12 will launch this process to discuss WTO reform. So I think that probably this issue could be also discussed there and encompassing what we discussed on this multilateral vis-a-vis plurilateral initiatives in the future. So I think that's an excellent message. So I think we could continue as FMG to support their discussion and by providing our ideas there. So with that, I thank you very much, Stuart, for making your time with us and providing so many thoughtful kind of elements here for our audience. And I also thank our audience for bearing with us. We have probably one or two to come, and then we will finish this interview series for MC12 and Beyond. So thanks again, Stuart.
Thanks a lot, Lou. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for your views, which I thought were very much to the point as well. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Stuart. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.